Welcome to the Israel Now Forum webinar series. I'm Maura Schreier-Fleming, Chairman of the Israel Now Forum Speakers Committee. The in-person Israel Now Forum is scheduled for the evening of Wednesday, October the 28th in Dallas. Today's program is being recorded, and please share the link with your networks so they understand why it's good for America and Americans to support Israel. We want to thank our webinar partner, Southwest Jewish Congress. Today's webinar on countering misconceptions about Israel features Charlotte Korchak. Charlotte is the founder and senior educator of the Jerusalem Education Institute, a nonprofit organization working to transform education on Israel and the Middle East. The website is jerusalemedu.org. Charlotte grew up in both the United States and then in Israel during the Second Intifada. She earned her BA in Middle Eastern History from the University of Southern California, where she was a Stand With Us Emerson Fellow. Charlotte became international senior educator at Stand With Us and engaged over 50,000 students annually, both online and on 5 different continents, so they could become effective activists for Israel. She founded the Jerusalem Education Institute to dispel misconceptions about Israel and fight anti-Semitism. Please use the Q&A Zoom feature to submit your questions during the webinar. We'll have time for questions. So Charlotte, let's start with discussing your work. Can you tell us what you find to be the top 3 misconceptions about Israel?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So the top 3. So first and foremost, I would say the most important and fundamental misconception is the idea that Jews are not from the land of Israel. This is probably the core of everything. If somebody believes that Jews are simply white European colonizers who have no connection and no place in that land, then really technically everything else that Israel does will be not justified, will be illegitimate, right? Because if the founding is illegitimate, then when an Israeli might say we have the right to defend ourselves, they would say, no, you don't. You shouldn't be there to begin with. And so you see it all goes back to that fundamental misconception and that lie that is spread around the world that Jews are simply white European colonizers who showed up to this land as foreigners. So that's number 1. Number 2, I would say the next step of that is tying colonization to, of course, what it's rooted in oftentimes, which was racism, and basically painting Zionism as a racist movement, right? Oftentimes now compared to Nazism, fascism, etc. And that also then bleeds into other accusations like apartheid, which is a big one. And then, of course, unfortunately, the most recent claim that I would say existed before but has now taken on an entirely different life of its own is the claim of genocide. The idea that Israel committed a genocide in Gaza over the last 3 years. And I have to tell you, even when I was in university, I sometimes heard that claim of genocide. And we're talking, I was in university from 2005 to 2009. And so it wasn't a claim that was not said prior to October 7th, but it again took on a life of its own after October 7th and now is widespread. And most people would say, everyone knows that there's a genocide. And it's just many people have chalked it up to this is just the truth now. So those are kind of, I would say, the top 3 that really everything else rests upon.
So where do you think these misconceptions about Israel come from? Is it the media? Is it K-12 schools, universities, foreign governments, or someplace else?
Well, if you go back, we can definitely start with a foreign government, and that was the Soviet government of the 50s all the way through. They were the main promulgators of anti-Zionism. And that's also something, I mean, it's a side note, maybe we can get into it, but when people talk about anti-Semitism, we learn about anti-Semitism usually when we talk about the Holocaust. And that's super important. I would not say don't teach the Holocaust, but when you only learn the Holocaust, you learn just right-wing anti-Semitism. You learn about anti-Semitism and how it manifested in Germany, which was very blatant. Jews are bad, kill the Jews.
Mm.
Then came the Soviet Union. And yes, you could say there was anti-Semitism there in the sense that they just didn't allow Jews to be Jewish. But the other side of that was anti-Zionism. And that was their form of anti-Semitism. That was their way of targeting the Jews. And so First of all, the Soviets, and the Soviets worked directly hand in hand with the PLO, which was formed in 1964. And then Yasser Arafat became really one of the most brilliant propagandists for the Palestinians. And he worked hand in hand with the Soviet Union and their government to promulgate that information around the world. So if you kind of trace it, you get to 1975, and that rhetoric has now made its way into the mainstream, which then enables the UN to pass the famous UN Resolution 3379, which is the resolution declaring Zionism racism in 1975. And that was all really a based on propaganda that was promulgated by the PLO and by the Soviet Union, which really shifted the conflict from being a national conflict, which is what it was. It was a conflict about nationalism, about two peoples wanting their own country, wanting self-determination, shifting it to a racial conflict.
Mhm.
And getting us, because why? It was the era of anti-racism, right? Civil rights movement in America, anti-apartheid was starting to grow. And so they shifted it to be the popular, the sexier kind of concept that was out there at the time. So definitely it started there. And then if
Mhm.
you continue, obviously there are other foreign governments, Iran, we can talk about their influence. And now there are people who have come to places like the United States and to the UK, and they become professors in universities and they promulgate this information. And not just professors, like you said, K through 12, they become seventh grade teachers and they start to plant this information into the education. Unfortunately, now it really comes from everywhere.
Mhm.
And social media allowed it to expand and grow in a way like we've never seen before. And so now it's almost impossible to put your finger on where the lies are coming from because they could be coming straight from Hamas. The idea that Israel was using, excuse me for this, but that Israel was training dogs to rape
Yeah.
Palestinian prisoners, which of course the New York Times then decided to promulgate as well with no evidence, and many human rights or many animal rights organizations saying it's impossible. But that is a lie that came straight from Hamas. So even
No.
today, it's the
Mhm.
terrorists themselves that can be promulgating this information.
You bring up something that's very important. That lie goes back to Hitler's propaganda because what he said in 1925 was the big lie. And he said, you've got to tell big lies about Jews because most honest people won't believe the little ones. And that's why he blamed the Jews for World War One. And what you just talked about, the Jew haters are alive today with the big lies. The New York Times and Christoph's article about the dogs, Hezbollah's the big lies about Gaza's genocide, Hamas, the Council of American and Islamic Relations, and all their lies. What is an effective strategy to fight the big lies?
I mean, all we can do. Personally, I'm kind of a grassroots educator, and I very much believe that we are now fighting a fight of just of words and individuals. And the way that I think we can actually shift the conversation is by having one-on-one conversations. Mass media campaigns have not worked. We need to have real personal one-on-ones with individuals, explaining them what anti-Semitism looks like, what anti-Zionism looks like, because I very much believe that the vast majority of people out there just don't know. And oftentimes it's not that they just don't care, it's that they don't know that they need to care. And they won't know unless you talk to them. And so to me, it's first and foremost good, proper education on Israel and on anti-Semitism, and then really inspiring everybody who this matters to go out and talk to other people about it. Because social media campaigns don't work. We don't know what to believe anymore. Everyone's out there and it's a numbers game, and we're never going to win the numbers game on social media unless God, I mean, obviously Jews, but then anybody who's an ally of the Jews has to jump in. And even then, we're still probably the minority. So I really think it's a one-on-one approach. And then also on top of that is inspiring young people and really anybody that if you're in a space with other people where this conversation is happening, to have the courage to speak up. You know, if it's in your college classroom and your professor is saying something that you know is false, it's having the courage to raise your hand and in a polite way tackle that issue and inform the rest of your class, not because you're going to convince the professor, but because the other students in the class need to know that there's another perspective here, or that what is being said is not true and they could easily Google it for themselves, right? And so it's really a matter of having the knowledge, having the education, and then having the courage to go out and do it everywhere we can. And yeah, maybe that's also on in the media, but I just don't think that's the way that we're going to. The media is driven by money, not by informing people. And so we have to understand that that's the battle that we're fighting. Is it's about selling something. It's not about informing people of what's correct.
So, Charlotte, let's take a student that's in school. The power is with the professor who gives the grade, and the professor maybe is an anti-Semite or an anti-Zionist or a Jew hater, whatever you want to call that person. That person has the power. What would you recommend a student do who is just afraid to because he recognizes that I'm going to get a failing grade if I speak up? What would be an appropriate thing to actually take some action to address that situation?
Things that you can do depending on your level of courage or really the kind of the circumstance that you're in. First of all, I would always say document, document, document. So if that means I'm going to address this issue, like let me just quickly push record on my phone so that I'm recording this exchange so that if he then goes to the administration, I have evidence for what actually happened. Here's my biggest piece of advice. If I was a student, I'm not going to tell you to challenge the professor aggressively. I'm going to tell you to challenge the professor politely, like any other student would. It's raising your hand and saying, Professor, excuse me, I'm a little confused because you said X and I know why. And the why is you need to put it all in there. So professor says Israel's an apartheid state. You respond saying, I'm confused. Because I've been to Israel. And Israel, from what I understand, from what I saw, is a democratic country. And you put all of the evidence in there, right? I walked around, I saw everyone treated equally, right? I'm not saying that there's no racism. Of course there is. It's a country like every other. But in terms of the law, right? I saw everyone be able to vote, right? I saw with my own eyes the equality in the country. And you just add any evidence that you need into that conversation, into that question that you're asking, because that then tells the other students, wait a second, is Israel a democracy or is it an apartheid? And they're going to start to say, wait, does everyone have the right to vote in Israel? And then all of a sudden, so it's not allowing the professor to then, if you say, well, I thought Israel was a democracy, and then he says, and then he starts to add all more lies. No, no, you have to add all of that evidence into your question so that other people can hear what you have to say. Because the professor is obviously going to respond with his own response that is going to include more probably lies, fabrications, or things that are taken out of context. And so that's one way. And again, if he tries to penalize you, right? I would already say, like, after that exchange, go immediately to the administration above him. Say that this is what happened, have documentation of it. That way, if in the future that professor chooses to penalize you because you've shown that you're a Zionist in his class, you have the evidence. Evidence is
Illegal.
crucial.
Yeah,
It's
that's
really
illegal.
crucial. And it's the only way that professors can really be held accountable because they can just say that's not how it happened. And so if you have the documentation, and then the other way is if you don't want to speak up, is note it and then go to the administration after and say, I'm being taught things that are factually incorrect, and that's problematic, or is an opinion. And if his opinion is that it's an apartheid, okay, but I need to also be presented the other counter argument. And actually, to wrap this up, the one thing I would always say to students is if a professor presents just one argument, the easiest thing you can do is just raise your hand and you can say, hey, professor, what's the counter argument to this? When
Good.
I was in school, Edward Said was put in front of me. Of course he was, right? He was a scholar of the Middle East. Of course he was put in front of me. But so was Samuel Huntington, who went against Edward Said. They argued against each other. And I was at a university at a time where both arguments were put in front of me, and I was allowed to look at both and argue the merits of both. Today, you're just given Edward Said.
This
So
is
again, it's all it is demanding of your professor in a polite way. Hey, professor, what's the counter argument? If they say there is no counter argument, that's when you have to say, excuse me, professor, with all due respect, there's no such thing like that in academia. There's always a counter argument. It's wrong. I want to see it so that I can determine for myself if it's wrong or not. And
so
that's
that
something. And if then your professor goes to the administration and says, well, she was asking me for a counter argument, see, that's your job.
yeah,
That's
and that's
that's the way to
wonderful.
do it.
That's probably a great formulaic response that every university student can have in their back pocket. What can you please share with us the counter argument? Can you, like that first example which you worked on for apartheid, can you give the example if a courageous student wants to respond to the colonial empire one, or can you walk us through that response?
Sure. So colonialist argument, right? The response should be first and foremost, Jews should not be called white. Jews are a multiracial people who span the racial spectrum from white to black and everything in between. And that goes to the fact that Jews, while native and indigenous to the land of Israel, right? That's where Jewish language comes from, Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, the Jewish calendar, which revolves around the agriculture of Israel, even though we still practice that calendar as Jews anywhere in the world, even when it doesn't make any sense, because it's from our indigenous land. That's first of all. So they first, we're not white. And the reason why we're multiracial is because while yes, we're indigenous to the land of Israel, we were exiled. We were thrown out of our land and scattered around the world. And we were scattered around the world because we faced persecution everywhere we ended up. And one of those places was Europe. And Jews were exiled to Europe in the second century of the Common Era. So they've been there for 1800 years. And then after 1800 years of persecution, they decided to go home. And that's not colonization. That's an indigenous people returning to their ancestral homeland after really trying and attempting to live pretty much everywhere else and being welcomed with with an inhospitable environment and eventually usually a massacre and Jews being forced to flee. So Jews aren't colonialists. Jews are from that land. Now, I would also say, and I think it's very important to be fair and transparent and open and honest about everything. And I would also look at somebody and say, that doesn't mean that the Palestinians don't have any connection. They do. Some of them have been there. They can trace their roots back thousands of years. Some showed up 150 years ago. Either way, you're trying to denigrate or delegitimize my connection to the land. I'm not going to do the same to you. You have a connection too. We both have a connection. And that's why there's a conflict because our connections are so deep and we both want to self-determine in that land. So don't strip me of my connection. And I'm not going to attempt to strip you of yours because it's just factually incorrect. So that's the colonization argument.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So
Yeah.
how does AI, artificial intelligence, contribute to these misconceptions about Israel? And what can be done about that?
Well, AI as of now are trained to gather information from what's out there and spit out an answer for you. So that means if there's a lot more anti-Israel than pro-Israel or factual, then they're going to spit out the anti-Israel. And they don't know how to sift through. I mean, we saw what happened with Grok, right? When they tried to make it less left and more right, and then it became more anti-Semitic, right? These are the issues with AI. And so unfortunately, I'm not an AI expert at all. I use it in a very limited way. And I know every time I do use it to double check sources because oftentimes, I mean, I've even seen AI just manufacture a source, like create a random link that isn't real. So I would really, really stress to anybody that if you're looking for real answers, AI is not the place to get it. It's really not complicated. You need to go back to these old things called books and academic journals, which are things that are peer reviewed. And you need to read the peer reviews because just because a book was printed doesn't mean that it's accurate, right? You could read The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé and be convinced that that is what happened. And you could read a review of the book and realize that his scholarship is seriously questionable given how he chooses to pick, how he picks and chooses his sources. So we got to go back to old school, to teaching kids what old school research looks like, and to not believe everything that they read because they saw it online. They have to look at the source, they have to look at the source of the source, and they have to make sure that what they're reading is correct. So AI is very, very dangerous right now for us.
I had a question using AI and I knew it was wrong. And I wrote in the AI, this is incorrect. And the chat, and I think it was Chat GPT, not Claude, said, oh, you're right, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if that's valuable to do. Would it change the algorithm or not? But I'll just throw that out there. So,
It does. It does. I mean, like it's funny when I started on Claude, which to me I think is the best AI tool out there so far. I said to, I'm Charlotte Korczak. I started Jerusalem Education Institute. Can you go and learn about me and then come back and we'll talk? And so when Claude responds to me, he's like, based on you and what you do and the fact that you debunk these misconceptions, like here's a great source. And it really feeds me more correct information because it knows my background.
wonderful.
And so you can manipulate it, but that means that an anti-Israel person could do the same thing in the reverse.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
it's still very dangerous. But yes, it will tell you when it's wrong sometimes. I mean, I had a funny encounter with my partner. We were sitting there asking ChatGPT who was the president, and it kept telling us that it was Joe Biden. And we said, "Are you sure it's 2026?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah, Joe Biden is the president." And I recorded it on my phone because I was like, "This is," and then we kept saying, "No, it's 2026. Donald Trump is president." And he's like, "No, Joe Biden." And I was like, "Okay,
Wow.
I've lost faith in AI for now. Let's see where this goes." But I do, again, I think these tools, ultimately, the way in which human beings have turned against Jews, I feel like robots would do the same thing. I don't know why. That's just because if there's enough rhetoric out there that says that this group of people are evil and are the root of all the problems in the world, which is ultimately what anti-Semitism almost is always manifested as, is the scapegoating of the Jews as responsible for this thing that is bad in your life, then AI can take that and run with it and decide that, well, to better the world, we need to eliminate this group of people. I mean, humans have come to that conclusion. Why would AI not come to that conclusion? It's very scary.
So let me ask you a question. Out of all the groups that you talk to across the world, do you find a particular group anywhere that's more knowledgeable about Israel? And on the other hand, do you find any groups that are overwhelmingly less knowledgeable about Israel?
I mean, obviously, I would say the Jewish community tends to be more, but not enough. That's my I think we are getting better at Israel education in Jewish institutions, but we're not totally there yet. But obviously Jews are going to have more knowledge, just given that you usually grow up with Israel in your life and you start to learn about it as at a young age. But that could also be bad because sometimes Jews are fed only one side of the story and not the whole story, which can also create a lot of misunderstanding and one-sidedness. Obviously, the overwhelming audience that is very ignorant of Israel, or the younger generation, especially on college campuses. You
Mm.
know, if you ask them where they get their information from, I wish a college student would say to me, in a classroom, or going to the library. Instead, they say social media, which is so scary. You're in an environment, in an academic environment, and yet when somebody asks you, where do you get your news from, you say social media. And so that's why I think that the Gen Z is probably the most, not even ignorant, which I think is easier, but the most misinformed on this issue by far. Older generations seem much less ignorant, or if they are ignorant, they're ignorant. They're not misinformed. They just don't know much. Whereas the younger generation is misinformed and insists that, no, no, I know. No, no, the Jews are the colonialists. What do you mean? There was a genocide. What do you mean? That's also the scary part, is it's not just that they're misinformed, but they're so sure that they're correct, that they're correctly informed. So that's what I would say. And then I would say Christians are a fascinating group because they're really well informed on biblical Israel, on the Jews of the Bible. They're not necessarily well informed on current events in Israel and the more recent history of Israel. That's growing, but that's oftentimes what I see, which is good and bad. To have that solid foundation, knowing Jews are obviously from that land. Like, how can we even say otherwise? It's right there. We believe it, but also there's archaeological evidence to prove it. But having that lack of knowledge on modern events makes it difficult for them to bridge those two things together and then be able to present and advocate for Israel in the most effective way possible today.
Or if you were giving some advice for people today, young, old, everybody, where would you recommend they get their accurate information about Israel and to learn and be informed about Israel?
First of all, I'm going to say books. If you go onto
And
the
your
JEI
website.
website,
And your
yes,
website.
yes. Yes, if you go onto our website, we have a book recommendation section under resources, and I would say all of those books are worth the read. The first one there is Yossi Klein Halevi's book, uh, "Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor," which is just very easy read and lays out all of the core things you need to know. Daniel Gordis's book, "Israel: A Concise History of a Nation Reborn," is just a brilliant work that is a page turner. And then if you want to go real in depth, Benny Morris's book, "Righteous Victims," is probably one of the more nuanced accounts of the conflict going all the way back to the late 1800s till about 2001. It's a textbook. It's intensive, but it's the best way to get informed because it's so fair and it presents both sides just like Gordis's book does. So books, books. To me, it doesn't mean you have to read 100 books. You have to read 3 or 4 books to get that solid foundation. So that's what I would say is you got to read. This is a complicated conflict. This is not something people always say, well, give it to me in a quick bite. That's the problem. Sound bites, short narratives eliminate nuance. And this is a conflict that is beyond nuance. There's so much gray, and the only way is to slowly unpack it. And then I would say to somebody, as you're getting informed, don't stick to an opinion. Let the information drive your understanding. Let the information drive your opinion. So that's what I would say about historical stuff. Historical stuff, books. And then there are books that come out, like there are now a number of books that have come out about October 7th and the lead up to October 7th to help us understand how did that all happen? Where did we go wrong? And how can we correct this for the future? So a book, it's called While Israel Slept. It's a great book about, again, the lead up. And one just came out also in Israel. It's in Hebrew still. It'll be translated into English, but it's also an account from start to finish by, I believe it's Nadav Ayal, who's one of the preeminent Israeli journalists. He was just on Two Jews in the News, Unholy Two Jews in the News podcast. It's worth the listen. And that's the other place. So for current podcasts are long form. Podcasts give you the time to really have that nuance. A few podcasts that I recommend. First of all, the Times of Israel daily briefing, worth it every day, gives you the news in about 20, 25 minutes. Totally worth the listen. Very fair, very balanced. Then you've got Dan Senner's podcast, Call Me Back. Really fantastic. He leans a little bit to the right, but his people that he brings on are both right and left, which is the best. That's what you always want. Habib Red Gur has one called Ask Haviv Anything. Just brilliant. You should listen to his I would call it a rant because it was after Nicholas Kristof's article in the New York Times, and it was just brilliant. It was so brilliant what he said because it wasn't just a rant. It went into the depths of what was happening here. What is happening here? How can a New York Times, a really a legitimate journalist, how can they do this? It's really fantastic.
His father was a Nazi, Kristof's father was a Nazi.
But the whole thing, how does this happen? That's what he's unpacking. So those are I'm trying to think of, and the one I just mentioned, it's called Unholy Two Jews in the News, and it's an Israeli journalist, Yonit Levy, and Jonathan Friedlander, who's a British Jewish journalist who works for The Guardian. And he's on the left. She's leaning maybe left, sometimes right, but it's the Israeli and diaspora conversation that so rarely happens, where they sometimes argue because she's like, well, in Israel, this is what we're dealing with. And he's like, yeah, but outside, this is how it's being perceived. And she's like, yeah, but sometimes that doesn't matter because we need to defend ourselves and protect ourselves. And he's like, yeah, but anti-Semitism. It's a fascinating dialogue that they have every week. And then they bring on guests now on Tuesday. So, and if anyone wants, I can send you a list. And if you send out like an after... Yes, I can happily send you a list of all of my podcasts. And then the last place that I would say is certain these same people on Substack. Haviv on Substack, Sam Harris on Substack. There's a Substack called After October 7th by Kevin Deutsch that's really great. I would highly recommend following Adam Lewis Klein, who is really pushing the movement against anti-Zionism. And he's really trying to kind of frame anti-Zionism as a hate movement in and of itself, because it is. And we don't have to necessarily always compare it to anti-Semitism because they're both hate movements. Whether they are the same or not doesn't matter. They're both hate movements. So he's another thought leader, I would say, who's really brilliant right now. So books, podcasts, and then my go-to source for news is the Times of Israel. I think they're the gold standard out of Israel by far. I think they are incredibly fair, incredibly honest, and they have writers on the right and on the left, and they present a lot of different perspectives in their blogs. It is really worth going to the Times of Israel every day to get your news out of what's happening in Israel today.
So that was going to be my last question for you. Which newspaper do you trust? And that would be the Times of Israel.
The Times of Israel. So go on. They're a nonprofit. They are not driven by clicks. They're driven by really genuinely wanting to inform people. And their editor-in-chief, David Horowitz, is just one of the more honest, fair individuals out there who really stands for democracy and freedom and the preservation of the Jewish state. It's a really special publication. So the Times of Israel. Yeah.
And you just mentioned something very important that people need to understand. When someone is driven to get paid by clicks, the more inflammatory things they say, the more clicks. That's how the algorithm drives the web, and they get paid more. So it's not quality journalism. So as you point out to be the Times of Israel, I hope more people will go on the web to that. Well, Charlotte, sadly, we don't have more time to talk about combating misinformation about Israel, but what you do is such wonderful work to correct misinformation about Israel. Thank you so much. And I want to remind all of the viewers about your website, the Jerusalem Education Institute. The website is www.jerusalemEDU.org, where you can donate to support Charlotte's work and read more about her resources and become more educated about Israel, to be an advocate and combat some of this anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Jew hate. So I want to thank everyone for attending. We'll be hosting the Israel Now Forum webinars in 2026 on Tuesdays at noon Central. Our next webinar is on July the 21st at noon with Tricia Miller. She's the Director of Partners of Christians and Jews with CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, and she'll be speaking about Christian Zionists, how Zionism is good for Christians and Jews. So check out our website for announcements and your inbox. Our website is israelnowforum.org. Bye for now.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure, Charlotte.